for all of us being revealed. I'd also like to acknowledge that as we talk about the concept of engagement, there's lots of different expertise that sits here today in this webinar. So, but my aim is not to provide all of the knowledge around engagement. We don't have much time for that, but to provoke some thinking and some thoughts around the concept of engagement as well. We will be, as we're moving through today, I do encourage you to use the Q&A box, not the chat box. The chat box is not being monitored, but Q&A, we have Sophie and Linda who are monitoring the box, and will every so often just jump in and stop me and say, Steve, there's a couple of questions that have come up, or a theme of questions. If we don't get to your particular question, there will be a little bit of time at the end as well where we'll have a look at some of those questions. So please, throw the questions into the Q&A box. As I said, I'm not able to see those as I'm presenting this webinar as well. So please do that. The other piece of equipment that we will be using today is our mobile phones, or if you have a tablet or something like that. So this is one of those webinars where we do actually encourage you to come and use your phone. One, if you want to check up on what I'm saying and make sure it's valid, feel free to do that. But there are a couple of ways that we want to capture some confidential and anonymous ways of thinking. I have set it all up, so I have no idea who has presented, but it is a way of having some engagement throughout this process as well. So please have that at hand, and I'll talk about how to do that in a couple of minutes when we get going with the first one. The second thing I say, and this is particularly around the concept of engagement, is I like to encourage people to take a skeptical viewpoint, and I think it's absolutely important whenever we engage with any concepts that are human-centered, that are around well-being, engagement, to have a skeptical viewpoint, but not be cynical. And so what I mean by that is to question, to think, to ask yourself, is this really the case? That's the skeptical part there. It's just coming at it with a bit of a science practitioner mind. The cynical part is to say, I've heard all this before and it's no point engaging with it. And for me, it's really important to engage with a lot of this from that skeptical point of view, but not the cynical point of view. My name, as I said at the start, is Steve Macdonald. So I am trained as an organisational scientist, or a behavioural scientist. So really the work that I do, and the work that Human Link do, and the rest of the team that work with me, is around how do we capture the essence of who we are as human beings, and how do we bring that into the workplace and do that in an authentic manner? And how do we bring science, and it's not just about having some good ideas, but what is the science around good culture, good leadership, good engagement? What's the science around how we focus and function as individuals? And at the same time, bringing to that with a compassionate, this is a real life situation we're in here as well. So how do we get the balance between the two? So you can look us up on Human Link and get a bit more of a feel for what we do. But essentially, that's a bit about my background. I've worked through many government agencies in WA and across other states as well on this particular topic, concept of leadership as well, and also any constructs around kind of how we operate and collectively work together. So what I hope to do today is to throw some thoughts and some ideas in front of you that might provoke some thinking, that might be what you already have thought about, or might be new to what you're thinking as well. We will go through a range of different ideas as I present today, and this pack I'll make available afterwards. So please, feel free to use it and to capture anything from it that you would like to. I'd like to kick off with a very simple question, and one that we ask a lot. How are you feeling? How are you doing right now? What's going on? How are you? There are lots of different ways that we ask this question. I won't try to cheapen it by starting to use some modern vernacular, but it's a question that we ask a lot. And one of the processes that we encourage lots of teams and individuals to use is a process I'm going to ask you to engage in for the next period of time. I want to say, one, you're not going to share anything about how you're feeling in terms of the words or the emotions, because that's all about you and that's all your own space. But I'd like you to take you through this process, and I'd like you to engage in the process. And towards the end of the workshop, we'll come back to why this particular conversation is so important. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to, however you responded to that, how am I feeling, is to think about a number on this thermometer that you might assign to that particular word. So you might have just said fine, though I have learned that fine really means fine. You might have said pretty chilled, relaxed, stressed, anxious. There are whole lots of different words that we might to describe how we're feeling. What I'd like you to do is to place it somewhere on this thermometer. So, you know, the word that you came up with, what would it be? Would it be a -5? Would it be a 3? And you'll notice the labels on this particular scale are pleasant and unpleasant. And that is very deliberate, which we'll come back to and I'll talk about in a couple of moments. So give yourself a number. Some of you might have a couple of numbers. You might have a -3 and a 4. We're human beings. We experience multiple emotions and feelings at the same time. So can I make sure that you've got your number or numbers just locked away in your mind somewhere? I'm going to stop sharing that screen, and I'm going to share the first piece where I'm going to ask us to jump online and have a bit of a play around with. So on your mobile phones or your tablets, can I ask you to type in to the browser menti.com, MENTI.com. Some of you will have used this technology before. When you type that in, you'll come up with a screen that will just have a white box with some numbers on it. Can I ask you not to try and delete those numbers, because you'll notice that you can't, to type in the numbers 11, 22, 50, and 8 into that box. When you arrive at that box, what you'll notice is that there is a scale that's on a vertical axis going down the other way, asking you to submit the number that you felt. And if you had a couple, so you're a 4 and a 2 or a 4 and a 0, etc., you're able to commit to. Brilliant. We're in. Let's just get a read of how we're sitting at the moment, then just press submit. And as is pretty standard when we do this, the axis normally has most parts of it filled. Again, the competition here is not to try and fill the 5 just because, but to be a little honest and just observe where others who are on this webinar at the moment are also sitting. Obviously, we don't know names, we don't know who's there, but we can see a range from -5 currently all the way through to 4. So there's a couple of interesting pieces around, you know, when we look at something like this, and this particular type of graph is represented every time we do this. That in any room, amongst any group of people, there's always a range of how people are feeling right at that particular moment. You'll notice in the axes that we talked about pleasant and unpleasant, rather than good, bad, negative, or positive. And that actually becomes very important, because if you're a -5, that is data that your system is telling you about yourself. So yes, while it might be unpleasant, it's not wrong, it's not bad, it's not negative, despite the fact we've got the negatives in the number line there. The problem with calling some of those unpleasant emotions negative or bad or is that we tend to want to work away from them. We've been kind of conditioned by society to say, well, we shouldn't be feeling those things. So how do we automatically just try to move to the pleasant side, or what society often says is the positive side? The problem with that is that we're actually ignoring some very important data with how we're showing up. So if I'm showing up into a meeting, for example, and I'm on a -4, and then someone says to me, Steve, what do you think about this? If I'm not aware that I'm at a -4 and I'm just a little bit irritable or a bit edgy because the previous interaction was just a horrible one, or I've just had one of those days that, you know, I just want to wipe off and forget. If I don't acknowledge that I'm sitting in that -3 or -4 and think to myself, well, what do I need to do here? I can snap, or I can, if my style is to be reserved, I can move away. Also on the other side, if I happen to be at a 4 or 5, for example, which is great to be sitting there, we also know that it's momentary as well. That some, you know, I might start off the morning as a 4. I open up my emails and suddenly I move from a 4 down to a -2. I might then, because of whatever is written, I might then have a conversation with somebody and I move from a -2 and I feel kind of a bit better. I might move up to a 1. And then maybe it's time for morning tea and I get outside and I see the sun, and now I kind of remember about the weekend being at the beach, and I move up to a 3, and then I get back in the lift to go back upstairs and I see somebody who's been causing me a little bit of grief and I slip down to a -3. And this is just the nature of our day. We're never, ever at one number on its own, and recognizing where we sit becomes very important, not only for engagement, but for our own well-being. So if I go back to back to the chart that I was looking at there, I want to ask another question. I'm not going to ask you to share this, so thank you very much for placing those numbers in there. How's that showing up for you right at this moment? Whatever number that was, how's that showing up? What's physiologically, psychologically, what's happening for you? Sometimes, you know, people sit there with just that look on their face and that look that just says, don't come and talk to me. Sometimes it's a beating heart. Sometimes it's just a heaviness that seems to sit. Sometimes it's a distraction. So, you know, I can be, if I'm a 4 or a 5 or a -5, I can be a little bit bouncy. So sitting on my chair, and it's a phenomena we call the itchy buns syndrome, where you kind of bounce around on the chair on cheek to cheek, so to speak. And it's just a sign that, you know, physically it's showing up for you. So I just want you to take a moment and check in with yourself. How's that physically, whatever number that was, how's that physically showing up for you? Then to ask a most important question is, for the next hour that we've got together, this is valuable time that you've given up here. What's something that you can do quite specific that'll just help you get the most out of this hour, so that for this hour that we're together, or 50 minutes that we have left, that this is a good use of time, that it's a practical use of time for you, that you get something out of that you can take away with. Now, clearly there's a responsibility on me, but that's not a strategy for you. What's a strategy for you? Sometimes people say, I just need to get a notebook next to myself and just dump all those thoughts that come to mind as I'm trying to focus. For some people, it's turning off the emails. For some people, ironically, even though I've asked you to use the phone, it's putting the phone aside. I want you to check in to see, did you say things to yourself like, I need to stay present, I need to be focused, I just need to concentrate? They're actually not strategies, they're statements of intent. And the problem with statements of intent is that we don't always know how to do it. So the process that I've just taken you through is it's a process that has been well researched, by the way, around, are we able to name our emotion? Are we able to give it some kind of intensity rating? Are we then able to say, well, what do I need to do based on that intensity rating to get the most out of this interaction? That very simple 3-step process that I took you through, you can do in 30 seconds. And we know that it has significant impacts on not only our relationships, not only our memory, our own well-being as well, that when we're able to do that quickly and just center ourselves and say, where am I at the moment? And I often just imagine an imaginary thermometer in front of me to say, where am I sitting? It has the name it to tame it. And Professor Mark Brackett is the one who's done lots of research around this. What's very interesting, what the research is very clear on is that it does work. What the research is less clear on is why it works. And there are a number of different theories for that. So again, when we start to think about, you know, how do we make sure that we engage, particularly at this time of year as we're across different settings, but, you know, some of us are pretty tired, some of us are getting excited for, you know, maybe taking a couple of weeks off, just to sit in that space, because as you saw on that screen, everybody's in a very different space. I might be in a -5. That doesn't mean everyone else is. I might be in a 5. That doesn't mean everyone else is. Often what will happen though is that the state that we're in, we'll assume others are in that state, just subconsciously. So if I'm in a -5, I'll assume others are sitting in that very similar space. And I'll also start to notice others who might be in a -5 or -4 as well. And I might start to attribute what's happening around me, that everybody's sitting in that same space. Equally, if I'm in a 5, and we've probably all been with those people who, you know, they've just had a great day or a great experience and everything's bubbly, and you try to tell them about something that's maybe not quite so pleasant, and they try to silver line it or sugarcoat it or put some kind of lens over the top of it, which can be very frustrating. So when we talk about being human-centered in our engagement, human-centered in ourselves, part of the acknowledgement is that we are all on at very varying elements of the day on different parts of that scale, and just to acknowledge where we sit and to remember where others sit as well. I want to move back to the Mentimeter in a second, and I'll make the question live in a minute or so. I want you to think back in your world, and it could be the last week, it could be a few weeks ago, it could be a month ago, when you were just felt like you were just in the zone, when life was just like everything that was happening around you just seemed to be so easy. We talk about losing that concept of time, you know, when this period of time could have lasted forever. It might have been a task you were doing, it might have been a hobby, it might have been some friends that you were sitting with on the weekend and just having a good conversation. It might have been when you were down at the beach and just kind of watching. I was down at Leighton Beach on the weekend and just watching the windsurfers. I'm not a windsurfer, but watching them and just kind of getting lost in that moment. I want you just to recall a moment for yourself, if you could, please. When you're in flow and in the zone. And when you've recalled that moment, I want you to just get back into touch with what it felt like when you were in that space, when you were sitting, whatever that was for you, when you're in that zone. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to go back to Mentimeter. And on the next slide, what did it feel like for you to be in the zone? And this will show up as a word cloud. So if someone else has a word that you had, feel free to type their word in as well. But what did it feel like to be in the zone? All right, love it. Some great words up there as well. And again, you'll notice a range of different words from, if you want to, into multiple, you can. So we've got relaxed, peaceful, orgasmic. I won't ask for a description of what the zone was there. Unstressed, warm, just that sense of just being present, yep. Exhilarated, buzzed. Yeah, it's interesting when we're sitting in that space, and unfortunately, it's not necessarily always a space we can find. Sometimes we just find ourselves sitting in there, and that becomes a conversation we're going to have a little bit later on. So as we think about those words, as it feels like to be in the zone, when we start to think about a concept, which is the topic of today, around engagement, the reason why I asked what does it feel like to be in flow is that when we're truly engaged in something, and it can be work, it can be in relationships, it can be just in a hobby, it can be something we're doing on the weekend, that the words that we see on the screen and the words that you put up in your screen are the types of words that we tend to talk about. Now, the words here are very specifically more about work, the ones that are on this screen here. So I asked you quite a general question, but you'll see some layover between that. I feel involved, I feel committed. There's a sense of passion that sits there. Enthusiastic, absorbed, focused effort, and there's a sense of energy, and it can be a extroverted energy or an introverted energy in terms of a quieter, deeper type of energy. So when we start to unpack and think about engagement, what the contemporary research is showing us is that some of our ways of thinking about what it means to be engaged have actually been quite narrow for a period of time. And in fact, our COVID experience has really turned some of the engagement research on its head. So when we talk about engagement, we talk about the heart, head, and hands of engagement. That heart is that sense of purpose, that sense of why do I do what I do, that I feel connected from a purpose level into the work that I do. The head is the mindset. You know, what is it that I think about my work, and what do I believe about my work? And the hands is the skill. And I want to take a bit of time just to unpack those three areas. And I ask you to be reflective around, you know, do you have one of these three where you're able to do a little bit of a tick and say, yep, I have that part of engagement? Do you have none of those where for you, you know, you say, I'd love to have the head, heart, and hands kind of engagement? Or do you have all three of those, or two, etc.? So as we're working through this, I want you to process for yourself, and we are going to talk about deeper in a minute in terms of the bigger picture, but I just want you to focus on you for a minute when it comes to this idea of engagement: head, heart, and hands. So the one scientific slide for today that looks slightly more texty than the other slides, and it's quite deliberate because I just want to, as we think about head, heart, and hands around our purpose, around our thinking around our work, and around our skills about our work, to use this filter as we put this filter over the top of engagement. So when we talk about engagement, we're talking about levels of energy or vigor. So what's the level of energy from a purpose, from a mindset, from a skills point of view? So, you know, how much energy do I have for what I'm doing? How dedicated am I to what I'm doing? How, you know, do I feel like there's a sense of significance or meaning that sits there? Or have I kind of lost that sense just because of, you know, either I'm tired or because I feel like, you know, life just keeps conspiring against me, or the workplace sets up all of these processes. It just makes my life super difficult. And absorption. So how often do I feel like, with my skills, I just get to use my skills and I'm able to use those in a way that makes me come alive, or in my thinking that I just get to sit there for some moments and think deeply about what I do, or that there's a sense of purpose that every so often I go, wow, that's why I do what I do. So vigor, dedication, and absorption. Generally, when we think about engagement, and there are surveys that you will have done and provided comment on, generally most of those types of surveys are looking for the two scales that sit here. So they will call these scales a number of different labels, but there's definitely two scales that sit there. So one is identification with, and one's energy for. So how much do I identify with my workplace, my team, my business unit, those around me that I get to work with? So identification with is not just with the organization as a whole, but it's also with my business unit, with my directorate, with my team, with those who I work very closely with. And being clear for yourself around, who do you identify with? And what we often find in, organizations is that people can identify very closely with their direct people that they work with, but maybe not so much the bigger business unit. Or they might identify with the organization, for example, and not so much with those that they work with. There's no right or wrong answer for that. It's really just for yourself to say, well, when I think about who do I identify with at work, who are the people, what's the structure that I would put around that for myself? And particularly for some of you, with the machinery of government that's happened, there'll be identification potentially with where you used to work and maybe still trying to gain that identification with where you currently work, or maybe there was identification now and not then. Again, it's a personal journey and a personal story. After identification with, we then have energy for. And so this is a little bit related to vigor and dedication above. But this is where, I feel like that, one, I want to use some discretionary effort. And I want to be very careful here, because discretionary effort can be used as a bit of a manipulative tool. Well, if you care about your work, you'll do extra hours. Not condoning that and not promoting that, because I don't think that's healthy and I don't think that's helpful for anybody in a workplace. But there is that sense of, I can go the extra mile here, or I'll do that slightly differently because, I care about what I'm doing. So it's not so much about extra hours, it's more about the energy that I'm putting into what I do. And again, what we know about engagement, and this is very, very important, that it is impossible to experience high levels of identification with and high levels of energy for 100% of the time. That we are human beings and we'll move on a bit of a wave, and that sometimes we'll have high energy for, sometimes we'll have less energy for. It can be about the organization, it can be about those around us, it can be about stuff that happens outside of work. Because remember, we all have a life outside of work as well. So it's about thinking for yourself, when I think about head, heart, and hands. Now, where do I identify my purpose with? Where do I identify my thinking with? And where do I identify that I get to use my skills and opportunity? And when I think about energy, what's my energy in my thinking? What's my energy in my purpose? And what's my energy in my skills? So as we then break down these three levels, there's a couple of questions up here, which are rhetorical questions for yourself to think about for yourself. If you're thinking about, well, how do I know if I'm engaged at the heart or the purpose level? There are typically three questions that we could ask here. Why do I do my work? So I'm not talking about your job per se. I'm talking about the work that you do in your job. The second question is a very important one. What do you enjoy about your work? You notice the question doesn't ask, do you enjoy your work? Because again, in all of our pieces of work, there's always pieces of work that we just don't enjoy. We just think, I wish someone else could take this up. But are there elements that you do enjoy? And that becomes very, very important for an engaged heart and engaged purpose. That if you're not able to identify parts of your work that you can enjoy, this particular piece of engagement is pretty much null and void. Then in the public sector, and I think in terms of the agency world, this becomes very important. So a sense of what difference does my work make, not just for me, not just for those around me, but actually for the people of WA. Is there a benefit for what I do for the community of Western Australia? And again, some of you will, there'll be a very direct link for some of you in your work. You'll be able to say, absolutely, I do this, and therefore that happens. I make sure the this part is clean. I make sure we're coming up with good ideas. I make sure that we're, our R&D is cutting edge, so it benefits the community. So for some of you, that's easier. For some of you, it's slightly more difficult because your work might be 2 or 3 steps removed from client-facing work or stakeholder-facing work. So again, it becomes a really important aspect for us to think through it, and not just to make stuff up, to say, well, I'm really good at doing this and therefore WA people benefit, because that just won't keep you going for a long period of time. But being able to make that link between what is it that I do and how does that make a difference for the people of WA is an important question there. The second question, though, is the one that I would like you to, think through and focus on for yourself. So we talked about engaged heart. We then talk about engaged hands, which is around our skills. So again, question, what are you skilled in doing? What is it that you're good at doing? It's very interesting. Whenever I ask this question in a face-to-face forum or a group setting, people are very slow at answering this, and often other people have to speak for them. You're really good when you speak to those really difficult people, or you're really good at solving problems, and yet we're not comfortable describing that ourselves. We do know that it is an important element of being engaged to know what we do well. And yes, we need good reinforcing feedback from our managers and our peers, absolutely. But also at the same time, what do I believe? Where do I get to shine when I'm using those skills? So not only do I have those skills, I get to use them. It's a bit like most of the tools that sit in my tool shed. They don't get a chance to shine. And if they come out with me, they definitely don't shine. So I have the tools, but they don't come out a whole lot. And some of our skills are a little bit like that as well. The last area of engagement that sits around skills is actually, where do we get an opportunity to stretch those skills or to learn new skills? And this is very important from an engagement perspective. If you're just doing what you do well, but you're not stretching those skills, or you're not learning new skills, we know over time that your engagement, your dedication, your vigor, your absorption will drop. And so again, this becomes an interesting one. Yes, the organisation, our leaders can do some things to help us do that. But am I looking for some opportunities to try something new, to learn something new that sits around that? So engaged skills, where are these 3 that sit there for yourself? The last one, which I'll just take a little bit longer to focus on, is this idea of an engaged head. So we talk about this as our mindset towards our work. So this is how we think about our workplace, how we think about our manager, how we think about our colleagues, how we think about the work that we do, and also how we think about our efficacy. So that is our effectiveness in the work that we do. So can I do that particular work? And all of these are mindset pieces. Again, a bit like that scale at the start. If I have a certain mindset towards my work, so I think that my work is, just a bureaucratic waste of time, that, I show up to work, but we're actually not doing anything meaningful, that will absolutely impact how I go about doing my work. Now, this is also not about putting on rose-colored glasses and saying, well, I can see this, this stuff happening over there, but I'm going to ignore that and pretend it doesn't exist. That's actually not what an engaged mindset is. But an engaged mindset is actually questioning and saying, what is it that I believe about my workplace? What do I believe about my colleagues? Lots of very interesting research around a construct called confirmation bias, where I'll look at before. If I think my work colleagues are out to get me, guess how I'll respond to them? I'll respond to them in exactly the same way. If I think my work colleagues are kind of friendly, that they're warm, that they're helpful, then I'll respond in that way. In fact, I worked with somebody once who said, look, I just find it really easy to assume that everyone likes me. And if they don't, then I'm none the wiser. Again, don't want to take that one too far, but in her mind, that was this way of saying, you know what, there's no point trying to second guess what's going on around me. I'm just going to assume that we're starting from a positive place and then see what happens. What she was describing was her mindset about her colleagues. So when we define mindset, we're actually saying it's this mental attitude, but it does come from what we're taught, and it does come from our life experiences. We can't get rid of it. But it's a mental lens too, through which we make sense of the world. And sometimes we just need to pause and question our mindset and think to ourselves, why is it that I think that way? Why is it that I feel that this is the way that I think about work or colleagues? What is the evidence that I have for that? Maybe have I made up some evidence? And again, we shouldn't be making up evidence, but it's human nature to make up evidence. So when we think about testing our mindsets and testing our thinking, there are 3 psychological constructs here that I'd like to throw in front of you and just get you to think about for yourself. And we do these without realizing it. The first is the rule of first mention. And essentially what this construct says is that if I meet you for the first time and you say to me, Steve, this is, Peter over there, just be a little careful of Peter because, sometimes he has a bit of a rough day. That rule of first mention, if I'm not aware of it, will now govern my every interaction with Peter from now until sometime I become aware of it. So when I first go over to engage Peter, I don't walk over to Peter with a big smile and go, hey, Peter, how you doing? I might do that, but I'm acting because in my head, I'm like, well, sometimes he can be a bit grumpy, so I need to be careful of that. And then when he is a little bit grumpy once or twice, just because I stepped on his toes or I, sat in his seat or whatever, then I automatically go, well, there you go. That was that rule of first mention. It's easier. So one of the watch outs for us in our workplace is be very careful of two things. One is when we introduce others, when we introduce the work, how do we describe it to newcomers? Because the rule of first mention says that the first thing that we say, the first impression, the first memory that people have will govern their thinking until they become aware of it. So the second part of that is then becoming aware ourselves of that rule of first mention. Is this at the end there, is this a confirmation bias? Am I just confirming, everything that I am thinking about? Or is this a bias that is actually I'm unaware of and I need to become aware of it? The path of least resistance is another one for our brains. And it's kind of the way that we've been wired up, that if I have to make a decision, my brain automatically wants to follow the neural pathway that's the quickest, easiest, simplest neural pathway to follow, the widest neural pathway. So again, in my thinking, sometimes it's easier, and I'm going to push here a little bit in a particular area. So sometimes it's easier to make statements and not test those statements. And so some of the work that I'm very privileged to be able to do with an Aboriginal mate of mine is running dual cultural competency programs. So it's not cultural awareness, but it's actually how do we test our thinking? How do we learn and grow with each other? So, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal mindset, how do we actually grow and develop there? And what's really interesting, when nobody likes to be called a racist, very few people do. And in fact, one of the comments he'll often throw into the room is that most people, instinctively aren't. It's what they've done is they've accepted certain ways of thinking, in other words, path of least resistance. And so we'll label a whole group of people based on either the first mention of them or the path of least resistance. It's easier just to accept that stereotype, which is how stereotypes emerge, rather than question the stereotype. And then again, confirmation bias is a result. So when we think about ourselves at work, there's two interesting questions that for us to consider. What am I accepting that maybe I need to question about myself and about others? And am I believing something because that was the thing that was first told to me and I'm not necessarily aware? Now, remember, confirmation bias is very strong. So if I see the same thing over and over and over again, even if lots of other stuff is happening over here, confirmation bias will make this appear a lot stronger. So again, this is this self-awareness piece that sits there for ourselves. The other, so if I just test this confirmation bias, so during COVID, there were 4 questions that the particular research company asked consistently through COVID to check on engagement. And the question was this: do you have a manager who cares? And what the research showed very, very strongly is that when people reported that their manager cared about them, and the word care was very deliberate here, that the manager cared about them, they reported to feel more engaged, they reported to feel a greater sense of being alive at work and to be doing better work, essentially. What's interesting about this question is that sometimes we don't see caring behaviour, and so we automatically go back to the rule of first mention or the easiest pathway, the pathway of least resistance. So my manager, we jump onto a Zoom call or we jump onto a face-to-face and they're on their phone and they don't look up. And so if in my mind, they don't care about me, how do I read that particular behavior? I read that behavior as they don't care about me rather than they were busy or maybe they displayed really poor social skills. Both of those might be true. Now, again, your manager may or may not care. This is not a conversation about whether they do or don't. But what is important, and this is what the engagement piece is starting to say to us, is this question is very important about managers who care for us and colleagues who care for us, which was one of the other questions in that same survey. However, what we need to do in our interactions with each other and with our thinking is test intent. You see, we can never know intent fully. We can see behaviours and behaviours give us some information, but intent is not the same as behaviours. So when testing intent, does my manager care? Is that true? Or what of my thinking might need to be challenged? And am I just accepting a way of thinking because that's just easier, or because I keep seeing those behaviors? Or do I need to challenge my thinking? Again, it might be true. And if it is true based on behaviors, then it becomes a behavior conversation, not an intent conversation. And that becomes very important. So let's look at a couple of quite practical ways that we can increase our engagement. I'm going to ask you for some feedback here, which we're kind of going to gather, de-identified, of course, and using the same principle before around the organisation and managers, around what are some of those practical ways that we could actually increase engagement across the agency. So the question here that I have for you, and you will be able to enter more than one, and it won't be a word cloud, it'll be some statements. What is one organisational change that would help increase your engagement? So you might be a 19 out of 20 engagement, but if this thing happened in the organisation, this would actually help increase that. You might be at the moment feeling like you're a 2 out of 20, particularly as I talk about the head, heart, and hands. What's one practical thing? Can I say, before I open up the Mentimeter, I'm going to gather this and I'm going to pass this back to the organisation in terms of some of those practical pieces. What is very important here, and the reason I'm using the word practical, because what we're looking for, what are practical pieces? So again, statement of intent doesn't actually help. I'd like the organisation to care for us more. Well, what does that look like? What would it look like for that for you? I'd like, managers to check in with me more often. Well, what does that look like? Are you saying I'd like them to have more meetings, or I'd like them to ask about, if there's systems rather than the systems need to be fixed? And, obviously there are some that do, what are those specific things that would actually help you? So I want you, and we're going to take 5 minutes for this. If you see an idea that comes up on the screen and it suddenly prompts some memory, absolutely, add in your own one there. So we go as long as we need to here. And we can actually go past, once I stop sharing the screen, I can still leave it live for a little bit. So let's take a few minutes. What's a specific practical organisational change that would actually help increase, my engagement and engagement of those around me? So again, de-identified, we're not seeing who's there, we're just seeing numbers that sit up there. But this is thinking about the organisation, not your manager specifically. We'll get to manager. Excellent. Whoever put inclusiveness up, and if others have some thinking about that, what would that look like? What would inclusiveness look like? And what are some practical ways that we would see inclusion happening? So these will scroll up and down too as we're looking here. So we've got a game with inclusion. If I just throw the word trust in there. So trust, we know, is absolutely fundamental in any relationship, workplace as well. What are some specific trust behaviours? So someone there has mentioned that, IT, being able to have your own admin logins. Again, we're not looking at whether these are right or wrong. We're just kind of interested at the moment. What would trust look like? The idea of check-ins, team catch-ups, casual ones as well to build cohesion, but as well as the formal ones. Absolutely. Communication is a word that comes up every time we do this, but I like how we've described communication there. Yeah, the understanding of remote work. We know moving forward that that idea of remote work is going to become more and more important as well. Yeah, career path. Excellent. And again, I'll pull these together and we'll make sure these get shared as well. Not quite sure I understand the better dressed team. I'm not sure if that's a fashion statement. That one might need a bit more explanation. Yeah, trust is built through behaviours and words matching. The nature of approvals, yes, that's one that often comes up, particularly in large agencies. Okay, I want to move forward. So thank you very much for that. There's some lots of very, very practical ideas, which is what we're looking for there. I want to move forward now and thinking about manager. So, again, de-identified, so your manager or managers. To again ask the simple question, what is a specific behaviour your manager could do? So now I want you to think about kind of, whoever your manager is, wherever you sit within the organisation, that would positively impact your engagement. The reason I put positively there, obviously, because we want a positive impact then. So this is almost like a, if I don't want to dumb it down or simplify it, but it's almost like a cheat sheet for managers. If I'm a manager and I'm doing these, specific behaviours, this is actually going to have a significant impact on those around me. And again, if we think about micromanagement, I picked that one up before, so thank you for putting that one in. That was one of my speaking notes to speak to. I've never met a manager who wants to be known as a micromanager, who has it like as their management goal to be #1 micromanager, and yet we see it happen so often at all levels of management. So what does it look like from your manager if they're not micromanaging? Now, what does that look like? So acknowledgement of work, absolutely, listening to staff ideas. Again, we'll take a few moments for this one. And I want us to try and be a specific behaviour here rather than concepts. Yeah, holding meetings, we know is absolutely, particularly if they're in. Still take some moments. I'd still like some people to fill in here. I know we're thinking, and so I appreciate the specificity in a lot of these as well. It's a really interesting one around emails and speaking face to face. Great. Just don't need to bottle that. Whoever's got that amazing manager, we just need to bottle them and go talk to them and find out what they do. It'd be great to hear, what they do that does this. And again, your agency, like all agencies, will have some amazing managers. So thank you for calling that out. Have other managers who are doing their best, who are feeling constrained by potentially their managers or the system around them. So this is not manager bashing. So I really appreciate the way we're engaging with this. It's just about this practical, some practical things that would actually help. Let's leave that up for another minute. This one will stay live while I shift back to the slides too. It's always that tricky one, isn't it, for people in management, for anyone here who line managers to know, when do I delegate, when do I don't delegate? When is this creating more workload? When is this about being a manager and giving off work? What I also like here is that a lot of these, what I would call quite, when I say simple, I don't mean simplistic, but they're human behaviours, kind, listening, take time. They're what we call quite human type of behaviours. And, if we can create that humanity in our workplace, we actually are able to create a deeply connected workplace as well. Again, thank you for those. So again, we'll capture those and put those out as well. So as we think about both of those conversations, what's a specific organisational change and what's a specific manager change? The reason I wanted to call those out first is we're going to spend the last 10 minutes kind of looking at, what are some practical things I can do that would kind of help increase my engagement. But, if each of us individually does this, it collectively would help, the workplace be that workplace that we want it to be. But you can't do that in isolation of the two conversations we've just had. So in order to be able to have an authentic conversation, it's important to say, well, organisationally, what's enabling and what's getting in the way, and from a management point of view, what's enabling and what's getting in the way. So I do want to acknowledge that, because it is an important part of it. Otherwise, it becomes one of those just show up to work and be a good person and life will be fantastic. And that's not what engagement is about. It's not head, heart, and hands. So those two do exist. The question I asked for you is, what's your shadow? So and by this, and for those of you who are familiar with the Johari window, which is about connection in relationships and where our shadows exist, will understand this concept. But what I'm talking about here is, as you wander through the workplace, wherever your workplace is, whether it's electronic, whether it's face-to-face, whether you're with stakeholders, with your team, what's the shadow you cast? And is it a shadow you cast that you're proud of, that's intentional, that demonstrates you at your best? Is it a shadow that you cast that kind of drags other people into that shadow? We all have one. And while I'd like to say that my shadow is 100% positive all of the time, that's not the case. If this morning I had to spend 45 minutes at the bank asking to do something that I'd asked them to do 25 times, I didn't necessarily have a positive shadow with the first person from my team that I engaged with after that. I had to catch myself and go, whoop, I'm probably at a -4 right now on that continuum. That's not the shadow that I want to cast. So thinking about that for yourself becomes important. And, Stephen Covey has this great quote: we judge ourselves by our intentions and others by their actions. So you know what? You snapped at me. That's not good enough. And I snapped at you, but, I was tired. So just being honest with ourselves around this. Again, we're human beings. We're not going to get it right 100% of the time. Our shadow's not going to be the, purple unicorn type of shadow that we want it to be all the time. Sometimes it's going to be the opposite of that. And so it's just always good to remember, as I'm looking around at the shadow other people are casting, what's the one I'm casting? Is it one that I'm comfortable with? Is it one that's intentional? Do I need to kind of just be aware of what's happening there? This one here, when it comes to engagement, and again, want to be careful when I use these three particular questions that sit here, because again, in any context, psychological safety is important. But micromanagement, if I can just call out that one for a minute. If I feel like I've been micromanaged, one of the best questions to ask, and if I could encourage you to do this, is, did you intend for the decision to have that impact? So did you intend when you did that to cut me out of the loop? Often what happens is that the managers make decisions, or people around us make decisions quickly without thinking about impact. And just by having someone who's courageous enough to say, hey, was that the intent? Did you intend for that to happen? Or, were you just busy and kind of got carried away? It allows the other person to do two things. One is to reflect and say, oh, geez, someone's aware that I'm doing this, and no, that's not the impact. And also to speak into it. So sometimes I might say, yeah, I did, because I didn't feel that you had it. Well, that's feedback to myself, whether I like it or not. Or it's feedback for them to say, you know what, you're micromanaging, you're acting without thinking. So, where you're comfortable, and could I encourage you to lean in with that particular question? Another way of providing feedback upline and to those around you is to kind of provide the impact. Did you know that this is what happens when? So when you take away the decision from me, then this is the impact on. So again, not impact on self. Impact on self is important, but impact on others is more important. If I come back to the, whoever your ultimate stakeholder is, impact on ultimate stakeholder causes people more often than not to think it through. Now, again, skeptical versus cynical. If I'm cynical, I go, oh, whatever, I've tried this before, it'll never work. Oh, that'll never work in this place. You don't know my manager, or Steve, you've clearly not sat in my seat. Skeptical says, yeah, I don't know. Let me think about that. I might give it a shot and see what happens. Can I encourage you to sit in the skeptical space with this, not the cynical? The last one here, and this is really important. This is a question for you rather than a question that you would ask out. First two are statements or questions that you would ask out or up. Second one's for you. So if you find yourself complaining or having just one of those good old vents and how come they can't get it, ask yourself the question, have you actually told someone, and in their language, I mean, if they're a manager, speaking to them in their world, what's important to them, if it's a stakeholder and what's important to them, or have you just complained about it or bottled it up? So sometimes I think I've, told somebody something I'm not happy with, and I realize I've just complained to a mate of mine. And in my head, I think I've talked, but I've actually talked to the wrong person. So sometimes what happens in organizations, we don't actually provide feedback. We don't actually say anything to the people that need to hear it. because we've talked to everybody else who can't really do anything about it, but we kind of feel good about it. And it's not because we don't want to speak about it. We sometimes just simply forget because our brain goes, I know you have talked about it. Question to ask is, did I talk about it to the right person who can actually do something about it? So what's interesting in engaged cultures, those things you talked about absolutely happen, but also these things happen. It's not one, then the other. Both happen at the same time. The other piece for your own sense of engagement around head, heart, and hands is finding space for what energizes you. A number of years ago, two researchers, Ryan and Decky, looked at, what are those core drivers that every individual has? And it's played out differently for every individual. And they looked at three ideas: a sense of autonomy. It's not doing my own thing, but it's a sense of connection to the work I do, which is part of that heart and part of that head type of piece. Competence is, am I able to use my skills? Am I able to actually do them well? And relatedness is, am I connected to the people I work with? So it doesn't mean I have loads of friends and I might just be connected to two. But again, interestingly, a lot of you, when you spoke about organizational leadership, it was about connection to team, connection to those around you. And a great way of thinking about this is our happiness at work is impacted by our managers and those we work with. Let's be real about that. That has an impact. However, our happiness is not dictated to by our managers and those we work with. So yes, it will have an impact. Let's be true. But if I allow it to dictate rather than taking some form of ownership and saying, well, actually, where can I find energy? It's not a perfect world. In fact, for some of you, it's far from perfect. But where is the opportunity for head, heart, and hands? And this is essentially what this concept is about. When we start to think about energy, and I just want to take a couple of minutes to think about our own energy in this particular time of year, but also throughout the rest of the world, rest of our kind of year moving forward, is we know as we start to think about our emotional energy and our kind of just our energy that we have, that the green zone, the performance zone, is where we love to work, where we love to kind of be, and that's where we do our best stuff. The problem is we work with people, and people put us in the survival zone. That's a fight or flight, that reactionary piece of thinking. To stay in performance zone, and this is what performance psychology has taught us, we actually need to build in regular kind of rest breaks into our day, into our weeks, into our years, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's the only way we can actually stay there. When we're in the red zone, if we stay there too long, we end up in the burnout zone. And that burnout zone is, not burnt out necessarily, but just where we feel like we've got no energy. The concepts I've just talked about before in terms of yourself, what energizes you, testing for intent, testing your mindset. If you're in the burnout zone, I'm going to be pretty blunt here, you actually don't have the energy to really engage in those. What you need to do first is move into the rest zone, get a couple of rest practices for yourself so that you can clear up some space to be able to engage in the performance zone. See, the problem is that lots of us operate out of survival and burnout. And then, someone like myself comes up and says, hey, here's something to think about. In the back of your mind, you go, yeah, I know that's something I should think about. And it's not rocket science, Steve. I've heard this before. But if you don't understand where you're sitting in the energy zones, that's important, because if I'm sitting in that burnout zone, I actually don't have the energy to think about it. And so I move back into the path of least resistance. It's just a super easy way of doing it. I just go with what I've thought. I just try to get up and do what I'm thinking. So when we think about a couple of kind of very practical rest kind of ideas that you could think about for yourself, we talk about three ways of managing our energy. We talk about the idea of vacations, and now the borders are open. Some of us might try to get out eastern states. Some of us are just getting out into the rest of our great state. But vacations are about those kind of longer processes that we take off, where we take a week off or a couple of weeks off. What the research shows is that the benefit for a long-term vacation is held for about 4 weeks, and then it's lost. So they're good to do, but after about 4 weeks, any kind of rest that happened there, if that's the only rest we've got, any benefit is gone. We then have our evenings and our weekends, which are those shorter breaks, where we switch off at the end of the day or switch off on the weekend. And if you're one of those people who are just, super engaged in your work or just super busy in your work, deliberately building in every day some kind of transition break or some kind of connection with family or connection with what you love becomes important. What we also know, though, is that during work, or what is called micro breaks, are incredibly important. So this idea of switching off for sometimes just 60 seconds every 90 minutes or so becomes important for maintaining your energy. You see, if you just rely on evenings and weekends, if you get to work at 9, you leave at 5, and you completely burnt yourself out, the evening is just recovery, not a rest. And so what we're saying is, let's think about how we're building those micro breaks. Absolutely vacations, absolutely evenings and weekends, but let's think about micro breaks. And Dr. Stacey Parker has done some very interesting research around micro breaks, and it depends what we're trying to achieve. If we want to increase our kind of physical energy, then those on the left-hand side there, the water, the snacks, getting some fresh air, even just looking outside the window and noticing something and observing that. If we want to decrease our fatigue, then the ones on the right-hand side of my screen are the ones that tend to be the better ways of doing that. A word of warning around caffeinated beverage. After about 2:30 or 3, it still keeps you awake, it still keeps fatigue, but it can actually start to impact sleep as well. So thinking about, what am I trying to do here with this micro break? Do I want to increase energy or just kind of decrease fatigue? And the science is saying that it's actually slightly different where we focus here. David Rock and Dr. Siegel, a number of years ago, talked about when we're trying to get this balance of rest and recovery in our world, what's that balance that we're trying to collect? And they talk about it as this kind of healthy mind platter, appropriate sleep, a bit of physical exercise, time just to be focused, time to connect, time to play, just to do fun stuff, to have a bit of downtime where we just do nothing. So for some of us, that's reading. For me, it's, if the cricket's on, that's my downtime. And then just time in, just where it's time internal, just focused on myself, sitting, having a coffee or a beer just on your own. Thinking about your rest and recovery vacation that's coming up, thinking about your weekends and your weeknights. Where do you get this healthy mind platter piece? Where can you build in some of this just for yourself? Can I encourage you, as if you are taking some time off over this time, and we know it's a busy time, to think about, how do I just kind of really stop for a period of time and just enjoy those around me? And then think about, how do I build in some micro breaks next year so that I can show up and be that engaged head, heart, and mind. So as I close out today, and if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A. One of the statements that, kind of making around 2020, hey, it's been a weird year for a whole bunch of different reasons. We've had the pandemic obviously to deal with, but we've also had just the work stuff. We've had lots of personal, private things that have happened as well that are unrelated to COVID, unrelated to work, because life's also kind of continued. What is it that you want to leave behind, and what do you want to take with you? In other words, what are those things that you think to yourself, that was 2020, never want to touch that one again? And what are those things that you've learned this year that you say to yourself, I'd like to take that forward. I'd like to think about that and kind of how do I build that more into my rhythm, into my routine next year. Can I encourage you though, not to have this conversation just yet? If you're sitting in that burnout zone, that grey zone on the energy management, now's not the time to have the conversation. Now's the time to get to whenever you're taking your vacation and take a break and then think about this. It's also now's also the time that if you are in that burnt out zone to think about throughout the day, when can I get a couple of those micro breaks? When can I do it? No one else is going to tell you to do it. No one else is going to make you do it. When can I just go for a quick walk, get a glass of water, just breathe? What are some micro breaks that I can use for myself? So just in terms of closing out, and I'll stop sharing the screen slightly just to see if there are any questions there. This quote by Eric Hoffer: in times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. I've heard that second part of his quote, while the cynic finds himself equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. So can I ask you, when it comes to engagement, when it comes to kind of what you can do, what are the questions for yourself around your head, your heart, and your hands, around your belief about your work, around your purpose, around why you do what you do, kind of why is it that you got in that in the first place, and your skills? Where can you get to start to use some of your skills and use those skills in a more realistic way for yourself that give you some of that energy? So we will put together the thoughts that have come here. This slide deck will be shared. So you'll have access to this, and very comfortable with you sharing this slide deck with others and letting other people, having a look at it, anything that kind of stuck out to you, using that for yourself as well. Thank you. Appreciate your time. I know we are busy. Again, if anyone has any questions, Sophie, I'm not sure if there's anything that's popped up in the Q&A that we need to throw into the room.
Not yet.
Not yet. Brilliant. Thank you. Just letting my voice have a micro break. So if there are no questions, what I'll ask you to do for yourself is just take 5 minutes post this session. So post this webinar, take 5 minutes for yourself and just think about, for you, what has been a takeaway. So don't feel the rush to have to get back to doing the thing that you were doing. 5 minutes is not a long time. Yes, it might feel like a long time if you've got a lot of priorities and a lot of competing pieces at play. It might be if you're sitting at your desk and someone looks at you and says, why aren't you doing anything? Take the 5 minutes. If you need to go for a quick wander, and just take that time to reflect for yourself. Now, what's something for me that I can take away from this session that's about me? It looks like we do have another question in there. Oh, thank you. Did you want me to verbally answer? Sophie, are you happy with the type 1?
I think we're good. Thanks.
Yep. Brilliant, thanks. So last week I focused a bit more on some of the leadership ways of being when it comes to engagement. So some of the ideas that you've called out were some of the ideas that we talked about last week. Did also talk about how we create this, this space for ourselves around the energy as well. Okay, I'm going to pause the conversation. I'm going to leave the conversation. If you want to hang on and ask a question once everyone's gone, do so. Thank you. All the best between now and when you do take whatever your break is. Take 5 minutes now for yourself. Take 5 minutes just to reflect, just to kind of breathe. Most important thing you can do for yourself. All the best, and we'll see you around sometime.